All right, welcome back, guys. We have a really special episode today with my good friend Jared. Jared and I actually started writing about the Cubs around the same time back in was that 2013, 2014, something like that. And then we did some podcasting for Cubs Den at the time, and we kind of kept that up until the pandemic. And then I got a little tired of talking about the Cubs, so then I just kind of stopped doing it. And you've kept on. You've made some pretty good work for yourself, which I've been super happy for you, man. But how are you? Jared Wyllys joining us.
I'm doing great. Miles. I'm excited to talk to you today. And yeah, after I don't even know, we should have counted how many episodes of Cubs Den that we did. But after all those episodes, this just feels like a natural. We're just shifting topics now.
Right.
We
Yeah.
talked a lot of baseball. Now we're talking, talk some religion. Why not? So yeah,
It's a very just very seamless transition. Baseball to
right.
religion. People do it all the time. It's the tried and true
Yeah,
method. But no, I'm pumped, man. So I mean, I think last time I spoke with you, you were doing some work for a couple of the sports magazines, Sporting News. Where are you at currently? Are you at that news site, right?
yeah. So now, as it's almost been a full year, we're at like the 11-month mark of CHGO, which is a new sports media outlet in Chicago, which it's been really exciting. Um, it was around this time last year that I was being, I don't want to say recruited because that makes me sound important, but lured maybe is a better word.
Sure.
To join in, and yeah, it's been really cool because it still gives me a chance to do Cubs stuff, do White Sox stuff because that's what I like to do. But it's not just writing, but it's podcasting as well. And starting this year, going to be doing like some more like YouTube based stuff, so YouTube Shorts, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's fun, and it feels like it's like the next wave of sports media. This is kind of
Hmm.
the direction it feels like sports media is going. So
Yeah.
I like being a part of it.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I think you and I kind of lived on Twitter for a lot of years there, and that's kind of going by the wayside. So it's time to find out what other outlets out there. So
Exactly.
if you're at all interested in baseball and Chicago sports, especially baseball, make sure you give Jared a follow. Your newsletter is great, by the way. And I just love
Thank you.
your approach to. I think I've told you this a million times, but when you're interviewing players, you always have like very interesting articles coming out. So it's not your it's not your mom and dad's way of looking at the game, I guess is the best way to say. So make sure to check them out. But like I said, it's an easy transition talking about sports to religion. So Jared, my man, I don't really know a lot about your background or anything when it comes to faith or that regard. So I mean, where would you consider yourself at this point in your life?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is I'm a Christian. That's this the super short answer, but and even like getting there is I don't have the dramatic story necessarily. I think in a way, after listening to the episode with you and your dad, there are a lot of similarities because my dad was a Methodist pastor,
Oh wow,
for 40 years. He retired a couple years ago. And so I literally I grew up with it. Um, and so in a way, like as a kid, it was just, for a long time, it was just something that was like, yeah, this is just part of like who I am and what I do. I go to church on Sundays and youth group on, I think it was Sunday nights back then. I don't remember. But it was, for a long time, it was almost just like the same way that I was in like Boy Scouts or on the baseball team or whatever. It was just like, yeah, this is just part of what I do. And, didn't, wasn't really necessarily something that I took super seriously when I was young, middle school, high school. It was more of a kind of stay out of trouble sort of mentality about it.
yeah.
Like, this is giving me certain moral guidelines, but like the deeper stuff with it, just it took a long time for that to be something that I was giving more thought to. And I don't have, there's not like a, catalyst moment that I could say, oh, here's when things started to shift for me. I think it was just sort of a natural part of my like growing up and getting older, becoming a father. and and also like considering these things in a way beyond the surface, and being open to like questioning and doubting sometimes, and hearing more from other people's perspectives. And that's, I mean, just as an aside, I think, what you're doing here is really cool, but also it's necessary, because I think the more that people have a chance to like just hear from each other, and hear from each other in a way where you're not trying to like challenge everything, or prove yourself right, or tell them why they're wrong about something. Because like, even somebody's faith background that I don't agree with, that's something that's still like deeply personal and deeply a part of who they are. So to come at them and say, hey, you're just dead wrong about this, that's just, it's not going to get you where you're hoping to be. Um so yeah, I think just having that willingness, because that's a hard thing to do, is just like,
Mm-hmm.
it's okay to feel like I'm not so sure about some of this stuff, or I don't have the answers to some of these things, and that's all right. um and I'm more of like a, you know I don't know, I always forget which left brain, right brain, which one's which, but like, I think more in like stories and that sort of thing. So that resonates with me. And so I'm probably less inclined to ask some of the like scientific type questions, maybe similar like Brett Taylor that, you
Mm-hmm.
had on, because his mind just works a little differently. And so stuff like that's going to sit with him in a different way than maybe it would with me. So, yeah, that's like, I think the best way I can describe it for now.
No, I think that's great, and I think you're right. It is such a deeply personal thing, and I probably wouldn't be do and I wouldn't say I'm doing a fantastic job at this so far. I'm still kind of learning and getting my sea legs underneath me. But I think one thing that has been nice is that, like you said, I'm not, when questions are asked, it's not like, how can you believe this or prove to me this? I mean, sometimes you just naturally have those types of questions because something isn't going to make sense for whatever your background is. But yeah, it'd probably be a pretty difficult sell to be like, hey, all my friends want to come on here and just have your buddy yell at you for an hour and a
Right.
half, whatever it is.
Right. Yeah.
um, so I mean, so today, would you still consider yourself then Methodist, like growing up with your dad?
Yeah, no, that part of it I've fully let go of.
Yeah.
Because even like my dad, what the whole denomination part of it wasn't like, my dad wasn't, I don't want, he didn't stress that. That wasn't,
Mm.
to him, it wasn't like, oh, well, you've got to be Methodist. His concern was more, the point is the bigger picture. We're
Hmm.
Christians. And so whether you go to a Methodist church or Baptist or Catholic or whatever, doesn't ultimately matter in the grand scheme of things. So I'm thankful for that, because it didn't give me this feeling of like being tied to one particular type of church.
Hmm.
These days, I go to just a generically, it's just a Christian church or a gospel church. It doesn't even have a denomination. Um, so yeah, I don't hold on to any ties to the Methodist Church specifically. Although there are, I mean, things about it that I liked and that I miss in some ways, but yeah, don't, as far as denominations go, that doesn't,
Yeah, I feel like that's pretty getting more and more popular, especially within our
yeah.
generation. Like if you have any interest at all in being a part of this religion, that's like it's a very low risk way to go about it. Um, so I had no idea that your dad was a pastor. I'm surprised we haven't talked about that. Um, I know when I was growing up and my dad was a pastor, I think he got ordained when I was going into third grade. And so it's like a pretty, I was still super young. So it was a part of it right from like the get go when my mind started having memories, even. But it always felt like I had to be on when we were at church, or
Mhm.
like if you would do Sunday school or whatever. And usually if you're not familiar with Christianity, and I mean every religion probably has this, like some churches do, you either send your kid to Sunday school while the church is going on, or like our church, there was two services. And so then the middle part, that break, which is like an hour and a half, you would do adult Sunday school and then kids Sunday school. So like you were learning with your parents at the same time. But the Sunday school teachers were just volunteers. They weren't like, classically trained theologians. They were just some dude's parent. And a lot of times I would get questions of like, hey, this is what I think is happening, but Miles, what do you think? And I'm like a 14-year-old
Hmm.
kid trying to field questions. Like, I don't fucking know, like
Yeah.
you
Oh
should
yeah.
teach me. Right. But I mean, did you have any of those scenarios or those situations being a pastor's kid and having to take on the brunt of that?
All the time. All the time. It's like things just like what you described, where it was almost like, yeah, I'm 12, and they're, well, Jared, can you explain the Trinity and how the Trinity works? I'm like,
Yeah.
that's why I'm sitting here. I don't know.
Yeah. What do you think
Um,
love means in this context, Jared? Describe
right.
that.
Exactly. Or like, I remember I got called out in school once. My like sixth grade, I think it was my social studies teacher. We were doing some trivia thing one day, and he asked some question. I don't even remember what it was about. And like nobody knew the answer, but then he zeroed in right at me and he's like, well, Jared, you should know this. And I'm like, come on, man. And I grew up in a small town. So,
Right.
everyone knew I was the pastor's kid. So yeah, I mean, that kind of thing all the time. And not just that, but like I always, and I'm sure you felt this too, but always grew up with a sense of like I was under a different kind of scrutiny as far as like what
Yeah.
I did, how I acted. Um, it kept me out of a lot of trouble growing up, but not necessarily out of I didn't want to do things. It was more of well, I can't or I shouldn't because it's going to cause these problems. Um, and my brothers, it's funny, like it had the opposite effect on them. Like they just went for it, for better or for worse. But for me, it was like I always kind of felt like, yeah, I'm being watched or someone's going to say something. And two, because sometimes that did happen. Um, I remember when I was pretty young, like sixth or seventh grade, like goofing around for a substitute teacher once. And it got back to my parents, not because I goofed around for the sub, but it's because I was the pastor's kid who goofed around for the sub. So that was that was fun.
It's just such unfair pressure to put on a
For
kid.
real. For real.
Um, I mean, what for you? I mean, what was the scary part about getting caught, for lack of a better word, or being put in those situations? Like, where do you think that fear came from?
I mean, I think a lot of it was just the normal sort of desire you have when you're a kid of not wanting to disappoint your parents or just not wanting them to be upset with me. Um, that was part of it, but I'd be lying too if I said that at least early on, Christianity introduces you to a sense of like doing certain things wrong feels bigger
Mm,
than just like I told a lie or I stole a M&M's pack from the grocery store or whatever. I never did that, but like, some of these things feel bigger because I think too, like the era that I grew up in, and I'm sure you felt a little bit of this too, was like, I don't know, the way Christianity was treated, like in the '90s, felt very like you were introduced to certain concepts younger than you probably should have been.
mm, mm-hmm.
I was thinking way more about heaven and hell as a 11, 12-year old than I ever should have been. I mean,
Yeah.
and that's to some extent partially a product of like the way that these things were introduced to us. And like, I'm not even pubescent yet. I don't need to be thinking about like my eternal afterlife.
Yeah. I mean, I say this all the time. There's a lot of great things in any religion, and it's a very personal thing. You should be able to do whatever you want. I think the downfall of that is what we're talking about right now, which is like I still, and I don't know if this is necessarily trauma. I don't want to go, so overboard to say that, but it is something when I think about like dying and living, like you're right. Those things were
Yeah.
such a heavy thing. And it's like hearing even my dad be up at the pulpit being like, the only way to get to heaven is believing in Jesus Christ. And the biggest sin is knowing that you could believe in him and you choose not to. That's like super heavy and still gets me to this day. And
Yeah.
that's like, part of the reason why I even started doing this is just to see kind of how people deal with that. I mean, so for you, being a pastor's kid and kind of going through these similar situations to myself where you have to be the all-knowing expert even at the age of 12, 13, 14, whatever it is, when did you ever, like, whether it was in high school or college, start to have questions, and what were those questions that you started to have?
Yeah, I think a lot of that came later in life because, and some of it was because to some degree I had kind of a sheltered upbringing in a way. I grew up in a small town, pastor's kid, did all the church stuff growing up. And then after high school, I went to a small private liberal arts Christian college. And so even as a college student, I
Is that
was
Wheaton?
actually went to Asbury in
Oh, okay,
Kentucky.
got it.
So great school. I loved it, would do it over again. But it definitely sort of extended that part of my life. For me, it was still like I'm surrounded by other Christians. And so, you know, the acts of rebellion that I did as a college student were just small potatoes compared to most people.
What was the
And
biggest small thing you did?
um, I mean, like going out and having a beer at Buffalo Wild Wings was like, you better go 2 counties away so nobody sees you, you know, and like get ready to hide it
Even
if
at
you have
like
to.
21 or,
Oh
or,
yeah,
or
yeah.
underage?
I'm
Yeah, yeah,
legal drinking age, but
yeah.
I'm still like got my Coors Light and
Yeah.
trying to put it under my shirt. Um, so stuff like that where it's just like this is so tame. I'd go home from college and people would start swapping stories. It's like, yeah, that's not my
Yeah.
experience. Um, but and so I think it pushed some of those questions later in life, and a lot of it for me just had to do with situations that feel unjust or unfair and trying to make sense of like, well, and it's a question a lot of people ask, but like, why does this happen? Why do things operate this way? um, why does it seem like some people will never struggle in their lives and they're not necessarily good people, while others who are virtuous and ethical and moral, just it's like they can't catch a break,
Hmm.
things like that. Um, and I think this came up. I think it was Brett that you were talking to. But my daughter asked me this question. We're out for a walk one day, and she said, well, what about people who just never hear about Jesus
Hmm.
for whatever reason? And she's almost 11, so she's young. But like, what what about that? I grow up in a country where this is just never something I'm exposed to. And thankfully, at age 40, I've reached the point where I'm comfortable saying to her, you know what, I'm not sure I have the best answer to that, but I know some people I can talk to, some people I can ask. And I gave her, as my best example I could come up with at the time was, if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia, the last book, the last battle, which is sort of C.S. Lewis was very adamant that these are not allegories, but the last battle is basically like the book of Revelation. And
Hmm.
so you have a character toward the end of the book who grew up in a different country and has never heard about Aslan. And Aslan in the books is the lion who's supposed to represent Jesus. Has never heard about him, but then because he had lived his life in a certain way, was still permitted access to, the book's version of heaven. So I told her about that example because where I'm at right now, that might be the best way to answer a question like that. But
Yeah.
and I don't know if that's right, um, but it's something that I think makes sense, because I think that you know I believe in a God that's fair, and fairness does not always look the way that we want it to look or think that it should. Um, but yeah, that's sort of a long answer to your question. But yeah, some of those kinds of things where it's just like it's tough to look at a world where people suffer and it just seems meaningless. And how does that make sense? What a God who loves us and who created us and who wants the best for us. Those are all things that I believe to be true.
Hmm.
And yet, here's this going on. And I'd be lying if I said that I've got that figured out or
Sure.
I'm totally comfortable with it. Yeah, that's stuff I'll probably always wrestle with until the day I'm gone.
Yeah, I mean, I think in talking with people, some things that I've learned is like peop people that say they're Christian or Jewish or Islamic, whatever it is, they always seem to have faith. But then there's things that no matter what, they're kind of like the unexplainable, and it's especially apparent when you have kids asking you relatively, simple questions when it comes, I say that in quotations, simple questions,
Hmm.
like what happens when we die? Okay, the religion can tell us what happens, right? But when you start to hear the how you get to heaven or how you might go to hell if you believe in that, then it becomes more difficult. And that question that your daughter asks is still one that, like, it doesn't make sense to me because I get different answers depending on who you ask. You ask one guy, that is a really good friend of mine, and he would say that the Bible is very specific on what happens if you don't believe in Jesus Christ or the Trinity, and that's that you don't get into heaven. And what does that mean? I don't know. Like, but the Bible would suggest hell. And so when you boil that down, it's like, well, okay, if somebody in this remote whatever somewhere else never heard about Jesus, never even heard about any religion other than what their tribe created, whatever you want to say, like they're just screwed. And
Yeah.
it's like, wow, man, that's not a God that I would want to believe in. But other Christians don't believe that. And so you have this weird sense of like you have to almost trust the person that you're asking. And then how do you trust that person? So I mean, like, when you get those types of questions, who do you turn to? Is it people at your church? Is it right? I mean, you're
Yeah.
also an English teacher as well. So is it, like you said, going back to some of the literary works that you're familiar with? Like, how do you handle that?
Yeah. I think my initial response to her came from stuff that I'd read.
Hmm.
And having, thought through that same sort of question myself. And so that's one of the first places I will think to is, what have I read or who have I listened to maybe talk about this subject and what have they had to say? And, are these people who I trust that they're making their arguments in good faith and that sort of thing? And actually, when that came up, I reached out to my dad and I said, hey, here's a question that she had. What do you think about that? And, he helped me with, I think a more filled out or fleshed out response. But also, like he said, if you believe that in order for someone to go to heaven, they need to have at least had the opportunity to hear about Jesus, then the responsibility that that places on you as a Christian person just becomes immense because, okay, so here I think that this is true. What a horrible disservice I'm doing to people if I don't at least try to show them that.
Hmm.
I can't make anybody believe anything. I can't make anybody accept something. But if I'm not at least sharing that with you, then that makes me a pretty terrible person, right? Like, I think this thing is true, but I'm just never going to say a word to you about it. Um, so yeah, there's the sense of responsibility, even duty, even, and that was the part that he emphasized was, especially now, like we have the ability in ways that we didn't before, to spread this as much as possible. But it really helps too to make sense of like people who choose to be missionaries and just the calling that those people have, where they're going to some of those places that I don't know that I would be willing to go, but it makes what they do even more important. Again, working from the belief that these people need at least the opportunity to hear about this, because if they don't get it, then um, that's it does feel like that's just pretty horrible.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also interesting the concept of just missionaries in general of like I
Hmm.
know I'm right. I'm going to go tell you
Yeah.
why not necessarily I'm right, but what I believe, and it's such a very Christian trait. Like
Yes.
there's
The
no
evangelism. Yeah.
yeah, and Mormons do the same thing. Like that's part of their going to school is missionary work. You have to do that for I think it's 2 years. But like Judaism doesn't do that.
Right.
Islam doesn't do that. It's a very like this is a you believe what you want and we have our tribe over here. We're going to believe what we think. So I wonder where that comes from. I don't know if you have the answer to that. This is I'm just kind of thinking out loud now
Yeah.
of like it's a very very Christian trait.
It is. Yeah. And I would be curious to know, like, say a Muslim person, if they were to come to me, like, you know, what would they say?
Right.
Because I think you're right. Like, and if I'm wrong about that, I'd love to know. But yeah, it does seem like very much a Christian thing to do. And again, I think it just stems from if this is really what you believe, that people need that opportunity, then yeah, you really have to go out there as much as you can. And
Hmm.
but it is tough, like you said, especially as a missionary, but even just in day-to-day life, because what you're doing is like you're trying to tell people that there's this whole thing about your life that you're missing. Um, and that can feel very like invasive and pushy and all those kinds of things if you're not careful with it. That's why like it bugs me when I see the like street corner type people who are shouting with their signs, and there's a guy that drives around Wheaton where I live who's got his van. There's like Bible verses all on the side of his van, and there's this megaphone thing on it, and he's always shouting about how everybody's going to hell and stuff like that. And I see that and I think, God, you are making this harder for somebody who's trying to do it sincerely. Um, and I think for me, what it looks like at this stage of my life is a lot of trying to model certain things and live in a way that I believe points people toward Jesus, because my personality is I'm not a good confrontational kind of person. Classic like middle child syndrome, peacemaker. I just want everybody to get along. I hate when people argue and fight. I try to avoid it as much as possible. So I'm not well suited to like go and just approach somebody. But I think that you can point people in that direction in other ways too, and that's what I try to do.
Yeah, no, I mean, to be honest, the way that you live your life is it like you're doing the right things. I mean, from the perception from me is that you are going to go out of your way to help anybody, no matter how big or how small, whether it's going to have an impact on you or not. Like that's just your personality. So whatever you're doing, pal, just keep doing it. You're a great dude. Yeah, I think the other question I had for you was, how does Christianity and religion like play into your life? Is it more of a currently? I mean, is it more of like a
Mm-hmm.
social thing? Is it just something that is comfortable and so you're there, or is it talked about in the home? I mean, I guess it must be talked about in the home because your daughter's asking you questions. But how in depth are we getting?
Yeah, at home especially, there are times when my wife and I are like very directly teaching our kids about certain things, and we try to do a good job of making it age appropriate. Because that was, again, like I said earlier, something that was I didn't really have that, and not my parents' fault, but like it was more of a cultural thing. But
Sure.
yeah, just not feeling like I was ready for certain things. So we teach directly with our kids. Like for instance, just yesterday, as we're recording this, we're at church and we had communion, and so we had like taken a day once and very like directly taught our kids, here's what we believe communion is. This is why we do it. Here's what makes it important. But at the same time, saying to our kids, we want this to be something that you choose to do because you want this for yourself. And our kids are young. Um, and so there's still a little bit of, they all took communion with me yesterday, but they were doing it, I think, because I was doing it, which is fine. That's like, there's nothing wrong with that. But in the long term, I want this to be something that you have really, truly chosen for yourself. And so that's kind of the shape that it takes as far as like what we're teaching at home. I think outside of there, it's most of it for me boils down to how I try to treat people. Um, because in really both of my jobs, the day job and then the sports writing job, I come into contact with a lot of different types of people. And what I want them to see from me, no matter who you are, what your background is, what your experiences are, I want you to feel like I've treated you with, the right amount of like grace and respect and kindness and those kinds of things. So my faith guides a lot of like my human interaction, even in cases where um, you might be somebody who I think there's major issues with the way you're living your life, but I'm still going to, there's still a baseline level of like how I'm going to treat you that's just not going to change. I may think you're making some horrible mistakes, but I'm not going to be a jerk to you, or, like that sort of thing. So that I think is where a lot of people may hopefully see it just in when I'm out in the world. There's a certain level of like kindness that you're going to get from me. And that is coming directly from, what I believe as far as my faith goes.
Are you lockstep with your wife on beliefs?
As far as like the core things, yeah, we're on the same page as far as the core stuff. But in the same way that like two people are different, she for instance goes out into nature and says that she feels much closer to God on a walk in the woods or on a boat on the water. And she always feels a little bit less like she needs the like traditional church experience. Um, and I'm still a little more like, hey, I don't know, maybe a little more the other way. So stuff like that where, but a part of being married for 15 and a half years now is like, yeah, we don't sweat stuff like that. And I know where she's coming from, and um, I respect like how she feels about some of that kind of stuff, but also it helps knowing when it comes down to the core beliefs, we're on the same page.
Yeah.
Because that would be tough.
Yeah, having a fight about how to experience God would be a tough one to tough one to come out on
Yeah.
top, I think.
Yeah.
Um, it's funny. Joe Evans said the same thing, that my buddy that was on a few episodes ago belongs to the Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he says that he gets a lot out of just being in nature. He lives out in
Mm-hmm.
Idaho, and says the same thing. So I think there's something cool in that, because I mean I lived out in the Pacific Northwest for a time, and you do get this, I don't know what the sense is, and maybe it just kind of translates back to whatever is comfortable for you. For me, it was just the quietness and the stillness. It was like
Yeah.
something angelic about that.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
so, I mean, did you guys, uh, what's the plan then when it comes to kids? Is it, this is how we're going to raise them, and like there's the foundation of things that we want, similar to how you live your life or how you want to be perceived. How do you talk with religion, or how do you talk about religion with kids, knowing that there's other options out there?
Yeah, that's a good question because it's we always share it from kind of coming from a place of this is what we believe.
Mhm.
Um, and I want you to know what this means, what this is. But yeah, we've tried hard not to present it with a sense of like, you must take this for yourself. This must be a part of who you are. Because I think, in my experience, a lot of times you drive people away doing that, and especially kids, when they feel like something's being forced on them, then their inclination is sort of to reject it. And they go to a school with kids who are Muslim and who are Jewish and have different backgrounds. And especially as they're getting older, there's some more questions about like, well, wait a minute, and with their kids, it's like, well, they don't celebrate Christmas. Why not? But those are good entryways into, yeah, they have a different set of beliefs than we do. And so far, given how young they are, um, I'm not going to lie to them and say, oh, I think that all of this is equally valid, but we try very hard to not disrespect the people who they believe something different than we do. Um, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong about everything. It doesn't mean that they're bad people or anything like that. We just have different sets of beliefs.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I've talked about this a lot, but I grew up in a very sheltered area of the country, and a couple of different times where like I didn't have those experiences of talking with people that believe something different in me until I got really to college. So it's cool that they get that early, because I think it just sets them up for so much success later on.
Yeah, it does because it's like I said earlier, it's different from my experience. I was super. I mean, looking back, it's like, geez, I didn't. Everybody around me was like me,
Mhm.
and man, that makes it tough when you get older, and you need that experience to just be around some people who are different from you are.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Um, I mean, you have an interesting background because pastor's kid, then to an area in high school where it's probably pretty homogenous, and then college, same sort of things. People believe what you already believe, so there's not probably a lot of discourse going on. But I mean, has there been times in your life where you're like, man, is this really it, or like any research into outside of the faith, anything like that?
Yeah, I think the times when I've felt most confronted by doubt, um, some genuinely traumatic experiences. When I was 16 years old, I was in a car accident and one of my closest friends died.
Oh, Jesus,
Um,
man.
and I mean, no exaggeration, I sat on the street with him while we waited for an ambulance.
Oh my God.
Um, and so as a 16-year-old, that was like and even that's young to really think about like mortality. But there was a period of like, wait a minute, because it's one thing to like talk about somebody passing away, but it's another thing to like watch it happen.
Right.
And so there was a while there where I was just like, I kind of like closed it off. I don't even want to think about this for a while because the potential realities were just too much for me to take at the time. Um, and so that was a period of just kind of like, well, I don't know. Maybe I'm not so sure about this. And then as getting older, I think um, when my wife and I decided we wanted a family, we went through the foster care system, and so all four of our kids we've adopted all four now, but we went through like hell for a while, and there was a long period of time where it felt, I mean, lonely. And so when I'd go to church and there'd be times of like, oh, well, God wants to be near to you and God's here to help you and all that. And I'd be sitting there thinking like, really? I don't feel that right now. I feel the opposite. Um, and so there are definitely times when I'm like, I don't know, because it was just like, you hear things described one way, but then I just kept feeling like my experience right now is just so much different.
Right.
And I can't say to you that like, the good news is I read this book or I did this and now got it all figured out. I think some of it is just like perspective and getting older and like getting through the other side of certain things where it's like, okay, right now that this still doesn't make sense to me why it happened the way that it did, but I at least can trust that, God wasn't actively punishing me, or that I didn't feel distant from God because he was moving away from me. Because if I'm honest with myself, there are definitely some of those times when I felt distance from God. It had more to do with where my priorities were. It's one thing to like have him move away from you versus I'm sort of retreating. And I've done some like reading of different books about like, okay, where does science really line up with the creation story, for instance, or some of these kinds of things? And definitely read some things that feel like, okay, maybe this helps me understand it better. Um, but and I think even now I'm still at a point where like I still like hearing what other people think, and where especially that if it's different. Tell me where you're at with this. I think it's fascinating because it kind of forces me to examine my own beliefs and think, well, okay, what do I think about that? How would I answer that question? So I think that's important to do.
Yeah, I mean that's a tough story, man. I had no idea that occurred, and I mean, yeah, that's one of the most traumatic things you could probably ever experience in life, man. And it would be weird for you to not probably take a step back from something you believed in because it's not providing you comfort at that time. But when you were having those questions, was it? Because I think a lot of people, like I would say, like screw God. Like he clearly doesn't care about me. So I'm good then. But it felt like you were like, did I do something to cause God from moving away from me? Was that more of what you were thinking?
Um, I think the initial reaction, yeah, was like, what is this? But I think as I progressed through some of those experiences more, that's when I understood a little better. It's not that God has done this to me. It's that we don't live in a world that's perfect.
Hmm.
This is not a world that, we can't, that we're ever going to be free from these kinds of things happening. And so it's, I can't expect that. And so if I'm feeling distant from God after a difficult experience, is it fair for me to expect, God to always like give me this kind of easy sort of life, and it's always going to be just kind of comfortable. But the moment it gets difficult, then I've got, then that's what I'm saying. Well, God, what the heck? Where are you? It's, oh, well, he's still there. It's just, this is not a perfect world. You're going to go through difficulty and some really horrible things sometimes, but God is no less there those times than he is in other times. But trust me, like for anybody who listens to this, who's going through something, trust me, I know that feeling of that initial reaction of like, well, forget this. I don't, I've definitely had that where I'm just like, the whole concept of like a loving God and God loves me and cares about me. Pff, no way. Then why is this going on? I've been there for sure.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, well, not awesome that you have to go through that, but
Right.
it's
No.
cool that people can relate to that, right?
Yeah.
It's not a unique thought to have. I'm sure that a lot of people go through that.
Yeah.
Um, so are you comfortable talking about the adoption process for your kids and just,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but you and your wife are white, and
Hmm.
all of your kids that you have adopted are black. Was that a
Hmm.
conscious decision? And how how does that work in today's society when people are starting to be a little bit more conscientious about race and how that affects
Yeah.
people's lives?
Yeah. So we never, when we went into it, um, we just kind of said the the race of the child is not something that mattered to us, because they ask you when we were
Oh,
getting
really?
licensed. They ask you, do you have a preference as far as the race of the children? And we always just said no. And some of that comes from the fact that so my wife has a younger sister who was adopted from China, and so the idea of having a family member who doesn't look like the rest of the family was not foreign to us. But yeah, I mean, we've definitely as like two, even now still, you get looks sometimes or people ask sort of weird questions. I remember when the kids were real little, we were in Home Depot once, and this lady stops us in the aisle and she's like, "Which of these kids are real?" And we're like, "Oh well,
All
man,
of
I
them.
hope all four, because this
You should
is
have been
about
like,
to,
wait, you can see them too?
yeah, like wait, what kids?" Um, yeah, because I'm like, what do you mean real? But down deep, I kind of know what she's trying to ask, but it was like, oh my gosh, are you serious?
Right.
Or people who are like looking at us like, where do they get their curly hair from? Okay, it's my friends, it's the 21st century. Like, do you really need this spelled out for you?
Get on board,
Um,
pals.
and so there's definitely some questions like that. And as the kids have gotten older, and speaking of teaching them stuff, we talk to them about like, we've taught them like who Martin Luther King was and what he did and what he stood for and those kinds of things. Like we've had those conversations, and we talk a little bit about like, thankfully they haven't really experienced this yet, but like there might be times when people treat you in certain ways because you're black. Um, and yeah, it's, I mean, 99.9% of the time it's like nothing. No one, they're just our kids, but there are definitely some times when it's, yeah, you get sort of shaken out of that a little bit, because I mean we forget, like I just look at them and like these are my children, but I don't think about the fact that um, I'm like Whitey McWhitey guy, and here's my kids who are not, um, and that somebody just seeing us out and about might think, oh, hey, wait a minute, what's going on? I mean, I took the four kids to the movies once, and my wife didn't come with us. I remember the guide that worked at the movie theater just straight up asked me, he goes, "Is your wife black?" I'm like, oh, well,
Unbelievable, man.
yeah. So stuff like that, where it's like, oh, you just feel perfectly comfortable asking me that. All right, that's cool. But yeah, I mean, and again, I don't want to make it sound like this stuff happens all the time, but it's yeah, it's
Well, I
there.
mean, it's just such
Yeah,
a different, it's just different, I mean,
yeah,
and people like feel it's amazing the sense of confidence that people
hmm
can approach you guys with that. And I just think it's interesting to have to tell your kids, people that you would die for, that they're going to have difficulties that even like you and your wife have will never have
hmm
to experience. Like that's such
right.
a fascinating in the worst way thing.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
and like teaching them about um, segregation
Yeah.
and stuff like people had to sit on the back of the bus and drink out of different drinking fountains and look at them and say, and it was people who looked like me that did that.
Right.
And our kids are wonderful. They're four of just magnificent people, but and so they're they understand, but it's like that's not an easy thing to say or an easy conversation to have, but also like it's real, and I don't want to like hide that from
Right. And they're coming to church with you on a regular basis, I
you.
assume. And like
Yeah,
Wheaton's not, I would say, a very diverse town. So I assume that most people that you're going
yeah,
to church with are white. I mean, so it's got to be, in every part, even from a faith perspective too.
yeah, yeah. Because Wheaton is funny because it's I think the number of churches per capita is higher than anywhere else in the world. Sometimes it feels like, but yeah, I mean, you'd be hard pressed to find a more like well churched community, which is both a very good thing. But yeah, when you talk about wanting to give your kids different kinds of experiences, it's not always a super easy place to do that. But then, like, we take advantage of the fact that it's a suburb of Chicago and we have access to, we're going to go to some different parts of the city and different kinds of places where, because I don't want my kids to be the ones who are like taken aback by someone who looks different than they do or has a different background or anything like that. And so the more times you are just in unique to you kinds of places, I think the better off you are for it. So yeah, you kind of have to be deliberate about getting out of your little bubble sometimes.
That's awesome. That you're cognizant of it. I mean, not that you have to do that. But I I just think you're one of the coolest people that I've met, Jared. Just because of, like I've already mentioned, just the way that you are, the way you handle yourself. Like, if you ask anybody in the Cubs Twitter sphere, like everybody has amazing things to say about you, and you're a fantastic writer. I was so happy that I got to be able to, quote unquote, work for you. We did it for free, but we got to work with each other and
So
write
yeah,
and did the podcasting stuff. And I just really appreciate the time here, man. I heard the school bell ring, so I know you only got a
yeah,
couple more minutes here, but I
yeah.
appreciate the time coming on.
No, I'm glad you had me. As soon as I saw that you're doing this project and listened to a few episodes, I was like, talk about finding, um, like there was this gap in at least in my perspective, in the podcasting world of like, where are these conversations happening? Because I want to hear this stuff. So it's been nice to listen to because that I think right now at this stage of my life is the thing that I'm craving the most is I want to either be a part of or hear people have these like really intentional sorts of conversations about stuff that's not necessarily easy or comfortable. Because I think, again, to repeat what I said at the beginning, we need as much of that as we can get. Because I think a lot of what's driving people apart from each other is the spaces to do this kind of thing. We don't have it unless we make it.
Yeah, and like everything, the loudest voices reign supreme, and I
Right.
think a lot of times we're taking in voices, whether it be media, magazines. Well, I guess magazines are media, so let's just say media in
Yeah.
general. Like we're getting the specific brand of like this is how you have a debate. Like that's how we grew up. Like we grew up with
hmm
like the Crossfire and
Oh
the
yeah.
first take stuff on, and like it's just you don't always have to yell at each other. Like we can talk.
Yes. Yes. So I'm thankful that you're making this happen.
Well, I appreciate it, and I couldn't do it without people like you, man. So I just appreciate the time. By the way, one of my favorite podcasts we ever did before you go was the Office podcast,
I
which had
still think
nothing to
about
do
that.
with Cubs. We just gave our
Yeah.
top Office episodes.
Yeah. And honestly, I think that was, I don't know. I mean, you saw the downloads, but like, I still think one of the ones we got the most feedback on
Yeah.
as far as like comments on the site and stuff is, and I love that people are like, well, what about this episode? Or what about this? Which is, it's just a testament to the quality of the show.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a blast. And maybe we got to maybe revisit that list sometime.
I wouldn't be against it. Maybe we'll do a Finding My Religion, Finding My Favorite Office podcast or
Yeah,
something. Let's try to merge the two.
spin-off episode.
Right, spin-off, exactly. All right, man. Well, all the best to you and your family. I really appreciate the time again, and let's catch up soon, all right?
Sounds good. Thanks, Miles.
See you, pal.